hope it's improving, but a stigma about mental health issues. And a lot of black women, felt, well, there were several things. They felt they had to be strong. They felt they had to be strong for their families. They felt, that in terms of like service providers, they couldn't show vulnerability. They couldn't show vulnerability even to other members of their family. And they didn't seek help from mental health services because of the stereotypes that those services held about black women.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of black women suffered at that time. But also, got to think about all these things happening in sequence.
Yeah.
So at that time, a lot of women generally were being given antidepressants, were being given Valium. A lot of black women and other women talked about, their nerves, and so they're being dosed up with Valium. And I think that in the 80s, when kind of mental health services started to realise the impact of actually giving those drugs like Valium and tried to stop issuing it and educate women generally about Valium. I don't think that black women received that information. So that I think there were so many things affecting black women at that time, yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about the next kind of stage of your work that you were doing after working with the training programs?
Okay, so after working with training programs, I actually went to work for West Birmingham Health Promotion Unit.
Yeah.
And so I was setting up a health promotion service because in the past there'd been health education services, and health education services were different from health promotion in that health education was about giving people information. Whereas health promotion was supposed to be more broad in terms of looking at changing society and societal kind of policies to improve health. So it wasn't so focused on the individual. So that it was quite an innovative time. But I think in the UK.
What time was this?
This was around 1984, around about 1984. But I think that in the UK we hadn't, although we were signatories to Health for All, the World Health Organization Health for All strategy, it wasn't really supported by government. And therefore, I remember finding myself in health promotion, starting to talk about a lot of these political issues, but it not being seen as what was then mainstream health services. And I'm trying to think whether it was when we had a Conservative government. Can't remember when.
I think so. 84. Yes, it must have been.
Yeah.
And so, what kind of were there any kind of specific challenges you encountered in wanting to kind of focus on black women in the work that you do, even if it be in that time period since then? Because I think because even now I think there are sometimes, at least in the work that I've come across and work that I've tried to do in the last few years, there is always an eyebrow raising about, why is there a focus here on black women?
Yeah. Just before I speak about that, I'll just talk about the political context.
Yes, please.
Because under the Tories and the Thatcher government, we actually weren't allowed to talk about inequalities in health. We had to focus on so-called variations in health, as if these variations just didn't come from, social and economic inequality, a whole range of other inequalities, political inequalities. And so we were already working against, so-called government policy. I think that that because we couldn't focus on, well, we were not supposed to focus on inequality, we did focus on inequality. There was no framework for us to look at black and minoritized women's health. Although there were so many different things that were happening at the time, because at the time, I don't know whether you've ever heard of the Ricketts campaign. Well, at the time there was a Ricketts campaign, and what had started to emerge from epidemiological data was that Asian women were more likely to experience rickets, which is a deficiency of vitamin D. And then everything was, instead of looking at it from a kind of political and socioeconomic perspective, it all became focused on culture. So it was Asian women's culture. They didn't eat the right food, they didn't go out in the sunlight, all of this stuff. And it was interesting because at that time, the focus, as I say, was on Asian women and on Asian cultures. And at that time I thought, well, what's happening to, black African Caribbean women? Because it was mainly African Caribbean, because we hadn't had the migration of people from Africa at that point. And I thought, well, what's happening to African Caribbean women in relation to rickets? And I couldn't find any information on diets of Caribbean women. I couldn't find any research. And so what I did was I actually applied for a research project, and we got the funding, and we looked specifically at Rastafarian young mothers, because Rastafarian mothers were more likely to be vegetarian, to actually do some research finding out what their diets were. And I remember I worked with a researcher, Val Sylvester, who had just trained as a social worker, and she and I had just had children. So it was actually working with the young mothers, and it was amazing, because you read even now you read all this literature which says about people being hard to reach, and we found the young mothers, once we explained what the research was about, were really, really kind of interested in the research project and participated. And that participation meant that they had to keep a food diary for a certain period of time. And they really kept the food diary. And Val and I tried to keep the food diary. And we found it difficult to do, but these women actually decided that it was important, and they did it. And what was really interesting from that research was that we found that African Caribbean diets were actually probably more healthy, as we knew, sort of, than English diets, because there were more focus on vegetables. Some of the mothers had fish. They used Caribbean cooking methods and Caribbean meals, so there was a greater proportion of carbohydrates and complex carbohydrates in the diets, so that they and their children were having healthy diets. At this time, and it's probably wasn't politically correct at the time, I applied for a Winston Churchill Travel Fellowship. And they're currently called Churchill Travel Fellowships, to try and dissociate it from,
I'm so sorry.
It's okay, in people's minds, from Winston Churchill. But my view at the time was, if there were organisations that were going to fund travel, and that it would be helpful for kind of my research and hence the wider community, then I was going to apply for it. So I actually got a fellowship which involved 8 weeks travel in Barbados, Trinidad and Jamaica to look at, and I worked with the Caribbean Food and Nutrition Institute to look at diets, which was really fantastic. So when I came back, I actually developed, and from our research project, putting the two things together, I developed booklets for health visitors, dietitians on Caribbean food, how to give appropriate dietary advice, because there was nothing at the time. And to be honest, even now, there's limited information now. So we're saying that this research was done over 30 years ago, and yet there are a lot of Caribbean women who don't receive appropriate information based on Caribbean diets.
Yeah.
Okay.
I apologise.
It's all
I was
right.
trying to keep it in, but
Have more water. I'm
Yeah.
gonna have some water.
it's been so tough with the dry air because I'm also asthmatic.
No, I've been finding I've been getting coughs. It is as soon as you get central heating on and it's warm. Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about kind of building that relationship with the community? Because you touched a bit on that, but
Yeah.
absolutely, I think it's a huge touchstone for a lot of the research that I'm looking at. Because the relationship between the researcher and the
Yeah.
community.
I mean, I think it's really important if you're going to do any research with any community that you actually build a relationship of trust. And so I'd been doing research with community groups, I say predominantly Hands with Young Mothers, but also Harambee. So I was kind of quite well known within local communities in Birmingham. And I think in terms of building trust, you have to be very authentic, and you have to be very, very open, and also to say to people what you do know, but what you don't know. And if you're going to do research, you need to be able to explain how the research is going to benefit black communities, and how that research is going to be fed back to black communities, so that you're not just zooming into the community, plucking out the research, and then forgetting about the community. So I think really I've always had that relationship with black communities in different ways throughout my career. I think in the 80s I was much more kind of on the ground, actually, talking to people, finding out from people, involving them in the research, and then actually explaining, why we were doing the research. And then when we got the findings, explaining what those findings were and what they meant. And I think possibly also because we did a couple of things on BBC News and also local radio stations, where we...
Is this as part of the project?
As part of the project, when we were disseminating the findings, where we talked about, we probably didn't call it systemic racism then, but basically we talked about racism within health services, in that information, say on Caribbean diet, was not readily available for Caribbean women. And so I think I've always had that focus on trying to be as honest as we can be in terms of research. Why are we doing it, for whose benefit, and how are we going to enable things to change? And I think that's important, because I think, over the years, I'm quite old now, so over the years I've seen, and it's been predominantly white researchers who've got the funding to go into black communities and do research projects without properly involving those black communities. And where sometimes they might employ a researcher on a short-term contract, that researcher doesn't have any impact on the writing up the findings. And I think there are all these things that we need to change. There's so much systemic research, systemic racism in research itself, and we need to change that.
Absolutely. I wanted to touch a little bit more on so working after you'd worked with the project, and you come back and kind of working on disseminating that within the community. How did how did that impact the work that you were doing later on?
In a way, I was quite lucky because I was working for a health authority in terms of the health promotion unit. So we could organise, I'm smiling because I'm thinking about one of the seminars.
Tell me about it.
I will. We could organise seminars for local communities, you know, about our research finding.